German logistics were notoriously bad in the Second World War, especially on the Eastern Front. This has led Diego to ask this question. What would have been required for German logistics to improve in the East? I.e., how much more build-up of trains and trucks during the interwar period were required for an efficient supply system on the Eastern Front? On that note, what steps towards the reorganisation of logistical command would have been needed as well? An army of engineers, perhaps? All these questions are in an effort to resolve the major flaws of the Wehrmacht, namely a lack of fuel and logistics. This leads to an even more fundamental question. If the Wehrmacht was an army that focused heavily on Bewegungskrieg, why too was it an army that lacked the logistics to support this form of warfare? We hear all the time that the German army didn't have enough tanks or weapons or planes, and that if they had, then they would have won. The problem with this narrative is that the German army did have enough equipment right up until 1943. For example, on the eve of Barbarossa, the German army had a surplus of 1,256 armoured vehicles, which were just sat in German warehouses. They had a surplus of 81,460 machine guns, 5,968 mortars, 4,132 anti-tank guns, 386 infantry guns, 2,066 artillery pieces, and 678 rocket launchers. And they still retained a surplus of most weapons right through to 1943. For more information about this, check out the book Enduring the Whirlwind. So they had the equipment, yet they didn't give the troops that equipment. And the question is why? Well, the answer is that they were struggling to supply the men as it was. So giving them more equipment that required additional supplies was pointless. There's no point having tanks if you don't have the fuel to drive them. There's no point having more anti-tank guns if you can't ship the anti-tank rounds needed to fire them. And the reason they couldn't do that was because of their disastrous logistics. I've given examples of how strained the German logistics were during the Stalingrad campaign in my Battlestorm series, so I won't labour that point here. But prior to Barbarossa, they drastically cut back on the number of motor vehicles in their divisions and rear services units, and gave peasant carts to each of the infantry divisions. They requisitioned all the lorries they could from the territories they'd conquered, and they even ordered more lorries from Switzerland, and they told the men to live off the land at the expense of the local population. But even with all of these cutbacks, they were still going to face massive problems. I mean, there were problems prior to the war anyway when it came to transport, because the German economy was a shambles. The businessman needs every bit of his ingenuity to circumvent regulations and restrictions and to avoid interruptions in production. Rubber, for example, is extremely scarce, and it is consequently very difficult to buy a new rubber tyre. It has become an officially decreed rule that no new tyres may be sold unless the old tyre is returned completely worn out, but this system does not work out in practice. Reserve tyres are needed so badly that firms have resorted to buying entire new trucks just to obtain new tyres. These tyres were then removed and the new trucks sold without the tyres as scrap iron. Business ingenuity in circumventing the state bureaucracy thus results in fantastic waste of materials, all in the name of preventing waste. And that was in the 1930s. For Barbarossa, the way that German logistics worked was that Wagner would decide which supplies needed transporting, then Gurkha's trains would transport them via rail to the nearest railway station, then Wagner again would transport them the last stretch of the way to the front line via truck or cart. And the Luftwaffe supply system was separate from this as well, essentially creating a major confusion and bottlenecks in the system. The Luftwaffe, so Wagner's men claimed, took a larger share of the railway transport that had been agreed upon, and even had officers armed with submachine guns riding on the trains in order to prevent outside interference. On top of this, Georg Thomas, who was in charge of the German army's logistics for the OKW, may have been part of the underground German resistance, along with people like Canaris. So it's possible that he was undermining the German logistics effort, although there's no direct evidence of this. There were, though, reports of various units hijacking trains to get supplies, starting as early as July 1941, a month after the invasion began. Wagner and Gurkha blamed each other, of course, and in fact the railway system, the backbone of the German army, was on the point of critical failure even during the summer of 1941, with the transition points from the European gauge of railway to the Russian gauge of railway creating major bottlenecks, and some trains were sent with mixed supplies which wasted railway capacity. Others sent supplies to the wrong places. During the whole of October, only 195 trains out of 724 scheduled actually arrived, and even this number included 112 left over from the previous month. There were also massive traffic congestions, with infantry marching along the few available roads, getting in the way of supply trucks and the peasant carts, slowing them down and preventing them from getting to the front lines. The result of all this was massive ammunition and fuel shortages. Spare parts for vehicles also didn't get through for the logistics units, so the number of operational trucks fell below 60% in the August of 1941 for the logistics units. By the 6th of October 1941, Army Group South was brought to a halt because only 48% of their trucks were operational. Between the 17th and 20th of October, no supplies reached them at all. The troops had to live off the country, which had been the plan anyway, but this wasn't good for the local population. There is no doubt that the logistics situation would not have allowed an advance by Army Group Centre on Moscow at the end of August. The situation only got worse when the weather deteriorated and the oil ran out. Hardly any trains were running in late November and early December. From the 9th until 23rd of November, only one fuel train for 9th Army arrived, and the contents of this one could not be distributed because the lorry's tanks were themselves empty. It's worth noting that the oil ran out before the onset of winter, and the logistical situation was terrible before this, so the weather only made a bad situation worse. Therefore, we cannot solely blame the weather, we have to blame the lack of oil and bad logistics, as well as the disastrous railway situation, all of which was made worse by the weather. And the reason why they ran out of oil and the reason why they were reliant on trains to ship most of their supplies was because of the massive oil deficit that the Axis was suffering under. Had there been a second Romania pumping out oil, they still wouldn't have had enough oil to meet their minimum requirements. I've been over this in previous videos, so I won't labour the point here. The point is, though, that the oil shortage restricted their ability to supply their troops, causing huge problems with the German logistics. Adequate stocks of equipment may indeed have existed in depots within Germany, but transporting them to divisions in the field in a timely manner steadily became a relentless and perhaps insurmountable challenge. Under these conditions, constant material shortages became almost unavoidable. A request for equipment took several weeks to reach the units in the field, which is quite a long time. And it's not just equipment. In 1942, Army Group B was starved of personnel, receiving the least replacements at a time when it suffered more casualties than the other three army groups. I'll be covering this in more detail later in the Stalingrad series. And as the German troops were struggling in Stalingrad, suffering from a lack of manpower, equipment and supplies, the 29th Motorized Division was pulled out of the fighting and was reinforced to such an extent that at one point they had more than 100% of their panzer strength. So it wasn't just a case of bad logistics, but it was also bad planning and inefficiency. Manpower and equipment and supplies were going to places where they weren't the priority, and other places that were the priority were starved of supplies. Summing up the train situation alone, Krefeld, in his book Supplying War, states this: "Planning and control of the railway transports into Russia were far from perfect. The governor of Poland, Frank, was uncooperative, and it was not until November 1941 that the army finally succeeded in having its demand for absolute priority for military trains accepted. There was not enough personnel to unload the trains, and prisoners of war had to be used for this task. Traffic control was decidedly lax, so that some trains were hijacked and others completely lost. Communication with local personnel was difficult because of the language problem, the system lacked flexibility, especially regarding the cancellation of trains, the forces allocated to guarding the lines were totally inadequate." However, the lack of oil, the reliance on trains, the potential for internal resistance, partisans, and even the huge distances involved only present us with problems. They don't explain how efficient or not the Germans were being with their logistics in the face of those problems, and they don't offer us solutions as to what the Germans could have done to overcome those problems. If, say, they needed 100 tons of supplies shipping to the front, and they only managed to deliver 50, then how efficient were they being? There's no way to know because we have nothing to gauge it against. A more efficient logistical organisation facing the exact same problems in the exact same way may have been able to get 80 supplies to the front rather than 50. Yes, they still failed, but they were better, they were more efficient. So how do we know if the Germans were operating efficiently or not? The answer is, we can't. This is why historians will say that the Germans failed to deliver the needed supplies, and they will say that they faced problems. But that's it. Their books will always fall short because they can't measure the scale of the problem, and they can't calculate how efficient or inefficient the Germans were being because they have no way to calculate that efficiency. And this is why so few books have been written on the logistics of World War II, because while you can observe the problems, you cannot measure how good or bad the logisticians were. They may have been the best logisticians ever, but we blame them anyway because they failed. But was it really their fault? I mean, yes, they may have been the worst logisticians ever, but how do we know? There's no way to know. Now, when I worked in retail, I worked in logistics, and I know that there is a way to calculate how efficient a logistical system is being. There's a reason why Amazon can deliver a product to my door the same or next day, and they're not the only ones who can do that, while the Australian Postal Service can't do that to its own citizens, or why the Germans can't get a Panzer Army to Moscow. There's a reason why the Premier Inn or the Travelodge hotel chains have enough beds or can build more hotels in areas where they can see there's a need for more beds, but the NHS doesn't have enough beds and fails to build enough hospitals, and it also fails to provide enough doctors and nurses, despite its budget increasing every year. And the reason why is simple. Let me give you a famous example of this problem, which I'm going to adapt to the Eastern Front. Imagine that you're a German logistician, and you've got to get supplies from Berlin to Stalingrad. And, to keep it simple, we'll say that there's 2 damaged railway lines captured from the Soviets, both the same length, that you can choose to repair with the limited resources you have available. Route 1 is very badly damaged, so this will require 3 steel to patch up. However, there's no bridges or obstacles in the way, so it only requires 1 engineer. Route 2's track isn't as badly damaged, requiring only 1 steel, but there's more bridges along the way that need to be rebuilt, requiring 3 engineers. Bear in mind that steel is also used to produce tanks, trucks and U-boats, so you don't want to be wasteful of this scarce resource that has alternative uses. Also, there's only so many engineers in Germany, and they could be put to work building ammunition factories, fortifications, farming, irrigation, houses to replace those bombed by the Allies, and more railroads in other areas of the front. So you don't want to be wasteful of this scarce resource that has alternative uses. So, which route do you choose? Well, in order to determine this, you have to figure out which of these resources is more urgently needed elsewhere. Is engineering needed more elsewhere? If so, it would make more sense to pick Route 1, which only needs 1 engineer and 3 steel. Or is steel needed more elsewhere? If so, it would make more sense to pick Route 2, which requires 3 engineers but only 1 steel. But how do you figure this out? How exactly do you determine which scarce resource which has alternative uses is more urgently needed elsewhere? We know that there's a high demand for tanks, trucks and U-boats, and cutting back on production of these could result in less equipment getting to the front. We also know that ammunition is important, as is the need for other railroads to send that ammunition to the front, and we know that fortifications are needed in the west to protect from a potential amphibious landing by the Allies, but also in areas of the front where German troops have decided to dig in. In order to figure out whether you should cut back on tank production, you need to know how eager every panzer division is for tanks. You need to know if they need a replenishment of the type of tanks that they already have, if they want newer tanks or not, and you need to know if it was better to produce more or less tanks compared to, say, ammunition factories, since it's not worth producing tanks if there's no ammunition for their guns or the infantry and artillery that supports them. Is there a shortage of ammunition? If so, is it due to a lack of production or a lack of roads, trucks, trains and railroads to ship that ammunition to the front? In order to figure this out, you need to know the stocks of ammunition of every single army group, army, corps, division, brigade, regiment, battalion, company and platoon in the army, their current consumption levels, their prior consumption levels, an estimate of their future consumption levels, how efficient or inefficient the logistics services already are, which is the number of trucks and trains and roads and railroads, and the distances and the amount of supplies getting to the front. You would need to know how much ammunition of each type there currently is sat in warehouses, on rail cars, on peasant carts, in the back of trucks, and in the pouches of the troops at the front, who definitely aren't claiming that they're out of ammunition even though they're swimming in it. Another way to use steel is to build new trucks. How valuable is a truck? How much capacity does each truck hold? How far can they drive? What's their fuel consumption? Is it better to produce bigger and heavier or smaller and lighter trucks? Increasing truck production through the use of more steel could help alleviate the logistics problems at the front, but by how much? Is it more efficient to use trucks over railways? We know that panzer divisions have been forced to drive near railroad lines because that's how they're getting their supplies, so if we used trucks, then this would allow panzer divisions to move further away from the train lines, helping them encircle the enemy. Or is it better to give the trucks directly to the panzer divisions? How much coal is there for the trains? How much petrol is there for the trucks? Is it easier to train truck drivers or train drivers? Is there a lack of trucks or just a lack of spare parts for trucks? In order to know this, you need to know the condition of every truck currently in use throughout Axis-occupied Europe, the number of spare parts in the warehouses, the possibility that some of the troops are claiming that their vehicles are damaged and not in use even though they've just taken the tyres off them, so as to trick the guys doing the surveying so that they don't get their vehicles taken off them, like SS Captain Victor Grabner did, commander of the 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion prior to Operation Market Garden, and he wasn't the only one to do this during that operation, nor the only one to do this during the war. It was common practice. So you can't even trust the surveys because the people filling them in aren't telling you the truth. So, in effect, to figure out which of these two railroad routes to repair, you would need to know the supply and demand of every possible use of each of the resources that have alternative uses. That would be a colossal amount of information that you'd need to know right now. How would you get all that information? Would you do surveys that may or may not be accurate? What are you going to do? Survey every division, every warehouse and factory, every commander that needs engineers to build a bunker? You'd have to survey all the people who take delivery by truck and every single soldier who has or needs ammunition. This would be a survey of almost everyone in the entirety of Axis-occupied Europe. Assuming that they filled in their surveys accurately, which is obviously doubtful since we have evidence that they didn't, the time it would take to send out those surveys and then have them returned would simply take too long. Most of the information would be out of date by the time it came back to you, since the situation is constantly changing. Plus, the amount of trains and trucks required to deliver the surveys to the respondents and get them back would only increase the demand of both railways and trucks, which in turn would increase the need for both engineering and steel, which is the thing you were trying to figure out in the first place. And even if all this mountain of survey information was available to you, you'd have to read through it all, analyse it, and then decide from all that information which railroad route to repair. I mean, the bottom line is, it's impossible. And this is why the Germans couldn't do it. This is why every army in the world has poor logistics, because none of them have figured out how to overcome this problem. Now let's think about this in a different way. Imagine that, instead of military logistics and war production, you were the head of a railroad company specialising in repairing railroads. You face the same two routes, but instead of doing this because some general wanted you to do so, you did it for profit. And instead of living in a Reich that had wage controls, price controls, manipulated interest rates and currency printing, all of which distorts the prices of every scarce resource that has alternative uses, instead of that, you lived in a world where prices weren't distorted by the central bank, and where the price of steel and engineering could be calculated. Now, it would be a simple case of choosing the cheapest route to repair. You'd multiply the amount of engineering required times the cost of engineering, and you'd multiply the amount of steel required times the cost of steel. Add them together, then choose the cheapest option. The cheapest option is not only good for you and your profit margin, but it also is the best option for the good of the military and the rest of society. Why? Because you'd be using those resources which are less urgently needed throughout the rest of society. Prices reflect supply and demand. Prices reflect the urgency of need. They ration resources that have alternative uses, and they ensure that those resources are not wasted on projects that aren't important. If, say, soldiers were expending a lot of ammunition, and so they were willing to spend their hard-earned cash to get more ammunition, okay, then more money would go to the ammunition factories, which would hire more engineers to help design and build more ammunition factories. The cost of engineering would go up because engineers would be in high demand and thus would be better paid. The higher cost of engineering means that those repairing railroads to the front would need to pay at least as much as the armaments factories for engineers, if not more, in order to get them to come out and help repair the railroads. The higher price tells people that engineering is more valuable. It doesn't necessarily tell them why it's more valuable, but it doesn't need to. All it needs to do is tell them that it is more valuable and that therefore they should use it less. So, rather than getting all the information of all the people involved with engineering, the price of hiring an engineer reflects all that information for you. And the price is all you need to know. You don't need to know the rest of it, just the price. The price then allows you to calculate the cost and efficiency of everything you're doing. If you're making a loss, then you're either being wasteful of scarce resources that have alternative uses, or the goods and services are not in demand, or both. If you're making a profit, then you're either being efficient with your scarce resources that have alternative uses, or your goods and services are in high demand, or both. When it comes to logistics, military or not, you can only know if you're being wasteful with scarce resources that have alternative uses if there is an undistorted price system. You can only know if the goods and services you're delivering need to be delivered now or not, whether they're in demand or not, or if it's worth hiring more truck drivers or train drivers if there is an undistorted price system. You can only know which railroad to repair if you have an undistorted price system. Only through an undistorted price system can we efficiently organise society, create resources that society needs, and not waste the resources that society has. Without prices, you're completely blind. Where there is no market, there is no price system, and where there is no price system, there can be no economic calculation. If the military or the NHS or any centrally planned or nationalised corporation or bureaucracy, if they operated with a profit and loss mechanism, then they wouldn't be black holes that suck in an infinite amount of scarce resources that have alternative uses. You would be able to calculate how efficient they were being, and they would be able to calculate what they need, when they need it, where they needed it. And if they can't stop wasting the resources of society, if they can't make a profit, then they'd go bust. But because they don't operate like that, because they can't make a profit and they can't stop wasting resources, they instead operate via a tax and inflation system. This is why they are incredibly expensive, incredibly inefficient, and are an incredible waste of both manpower and resources. The reason hotels can spring up with enough beds in places where there's high demand is because profits tell them where to build those hotels. A hotel that doesn't get enough custom, enough demand, suffers a loss and goes out of business. The NHS doesn't operate via profit and loss and so cannot make economic calculations. Thus, there's a shortage of beds and everything else. If soldiers bid for their ammunition, if they bid for their fuel, if the generals bid for their manpower and paid for those things, then you would know exactly where to send every single bullet, every single jerry can of fuel, every single soldier. The logisticians would know what was better: trucks, trains, horses and carts, which route to take, whether you should have 2 or 3 drivers in the same lorry to allow you to drive around the clock to get those resources to the front quicker, because prices would tell you. The Germans during the Second World War had a dilemma of whether to pull men out of the armaments industries to send them to the front, or disband units and send the men back to the armaments industries. The Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine were bloated, while the army and industries cried out for manpower. Foreign labourers and captured POWs were enslaved and starved to death rather than hired and paid to work. Putting aside the moral arguments and just looking at this in terms of economics, murdering the 2.4 million adult Jews who were of working age was obviously a costly loss of manpower to the Reich at this time. All told, at least 4.8 million workers died after the crisis of 1941 to 1942 because of the murderous ideologies of the Third Reich. Well, none of this would have happened had prices been allowed to operate freely. The priority wouldn't have been the murder of labour, because during a war that labour is scarce and in high demand. But of course, the Third Reich didn't have prices. They had Reichskommissars in charge of price controls and wage controls, and others who directly controlled the distribution of scarce resources that have alternative uses. And they had a central bank, the Reichsbank, that was printing currency and manipulating interest rates, both of which distorted prices and the value of the currency. The Reichsbank also stuck its nose into the allocation of resources and foreign currency, manipulating things there too. And the Reich even abolished private property. All of this killed small businesses, small companies, the Jews, and prices. Well, without prices, you cannot have economic calculation. You can't know the price of steel, or the price of engineering, or the cost of building new railroads, or the efficiency of the current logistical system. You cannot know where your priorities are, where to put more resources, and where to cut back. And historians will never be able to tell you how efficient the German logistical system was and what they could or should have done about it, because the German logistical system didn't operate with prices or a profit and loss system. Without prices, you cannot have economic calculation. Therefore, historians can tell you it failed and can point out obvious problems in it, but cannot say more than that because they have nothing to work on. Did they need an army of engineers, like the original question asked? Maybe. Or maybe they already had an army of engineers, but just didn't use them correctly. Maybe they had too many engineers and not enough trains or trucks or steel. Who knows? We'll probably never know, because you'd have to count every single engineer, every single train, every bullet, every nut and bolt, and then analyse all that before you have a chance of coming to a conclusion. And that would just be for one day. You'd have to do that for each day of the campaign and each day of the war. It's impossible. All military logistics currently operates without prices. All military logistics, therefore, currently operates inefficiently. Same with anything big that operates outside the profit and loss system of prices. And the reason why the Blitzkrieg, the Wilhelmskrieg military of the Second World War lacked the logistical support to keep it going was because too many people don't understand basic economics. Here are the links to audiobooks on YouTube of Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt and Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.